Hey guys, before you fall asleep tonight, I want you to imagine something simple. Waking up on January 1st, with no celebration to remember, no resolutions to announce, and no sense that anything has truly changed. In the 1800s, the new year did not arrive with excitement. It arrived quietly, cold, unannounced. For most people, January 1st felt almost exactly like December 31st, except the silence felt heavier and the future felt longer. There were no fireworks to mark survival, no fresh starts promised, just the same body, the same house, the same work waiting, and the quiet understanding that another year had begun, whether you were ready or not. Tonight, we're not talking about hope as an idea. We're talking about what the first day of the year actually felt like for ordinary people who woke up cold, tired, and unchanged. As you listen, ask yourself gently, when the calendar changes, does life really change with it? Or do we simply wake up inside the same routines, carrying the same weight forward? If this kind of slow, honest history helps your mind unwind at night, you're welcome to stay. You, Dan T, have to subscribe out of habit, only if this quiet kind of storytelling gives you something to rest inside. Lower the volume. Let the night settle, and let's step into the first morning of the year, as it once was. January 1st in the 1800s did not begin with anticipation. It began with waking. The body rose from sleep not because a new year had arrived, but because cold demanded movement and routine refused delay. In homes across Britain and the United States, morning arrived the same way it always had, slowly, dimly, without announcement. There was no sense of crossing a threshold. The calendar had turned, but the room had not changed. The cold was often the first awareness. Winter mornings pressed themselves into the bones before thought fully formed. Breath appeared faintly in the air. Blankets were heavy but insufficient. People lingered in bed, not from comfort, but from reluctance to meet the temperature beyond it. January 1st felt no different from the mornings before it. The year had changed, but the season still ruled everything. Light entered rooms cautiously. In many homes, windows were small, curtains thin, and daylight weak. The sky offered a pale version of itself, drained of warmth or promise. There were no decorations to suggest celebration had occurred the night before. Most households had marked the turning year quietly, if at all. For many, January 1st arrived without ceremony, noticed only by habit or necessity. Getting out of bed was an act of discipline rather than optimism. There was no cultural expectation that this morning should feel special. No one spoke of fresh starts in the abstract. People rose because fires needed tending, animals required care, and work waited patiently. The body understood this morning as continuation, not renewal. Another day had arrived, and that was reason enough to move. Clothing was layered deliberately. Wool, linen, reused garments, mended repeatedly. There was no new outfit saved for the year's beginning. Fabric carried the memory of previous winters, previous bodies, previous years. Dressing was practical, quiet, and habitual. Hands moved automatically, following patterns learned long before anyone considered what year it was. Breakfast, when it existed, was modest. Leftover bread, porridge, simple food warmed slowly if fuel allowed. There was no feast to mark survival into another year. Food scarcity shaped January more than symbolism ever could. The season demanded restraint. Meals were functional, meant to sustain labor rather than commemorate time. Conversation in the morning was minimal. Sleep lingered heavily. Words were saved for necessity. Families did not gather to discuss hopes for the coming months. For most people, the future was not something planned far ahead. It was endured day by day. January 1st did not invite reflection. It demanded preparation for the same obligations that had existed the week before. Work resumed immediately. Shops reopened. Farms required attention. Housework continued without pause. There was no cultural pause built into the calendar for rest or intention. Employers expected presence. Households expected contribution. The year began with effort, not pause. Time moved forward regardless of how the body felt about it. For those without steady work, January 1st could feel heavier. Winter unemployment was common. The cold limited opportunity. The new year did not bring immediate improvement. Instead, it stretched ahead uncertainly, long and unmarked. People felt the weight of another winter more than the promise of another year. Church bells sometimes acknowledged the calendar change, but even this was restrained. Attendance was routine, not celebratory. Sermons focused on endurance, morality, and obedience, rather than personal transformation. Faith offered structure, not reinvention. January 1st was absorbed into religious rhythm rather than elevated above it. Emotionally, the day carried a muted quality. There was no widespread sadness, but there was little joy. The absence of expectation shaped the mood. People did not feel disappointed because they had not anticipated anything different. The new year was not framed as opportunity. It was framed as continuation. For women, the morning unfolded within domestic repetition. Fires were built, floors swept, children prepared, meals planned. The calendar did not relieve responsibility. It reinforced it. Another year meant another cycle of care, labor, and restraint. January 1st was simply the next square in an endless pattern. Men stepped back into labor with similar resignation. Trades resumed. Tools were lifted again. Bodies carried the fatigue of past years without pause. There was no collective sense of reset. The body aged forward steadily, indifferent to numbering systems. Children noticed little difference. Time meant little beyond seasons and routine. A new year was not yet a meaningful concept. Cold mornings, chores, and limited daylight shaped their experience more than dates. January 1st blended seamlessly into the long winter stretch. There were no resolutions, because resolution implied choice. For many, life offered little room for alteration. Poverty, class, gender, and health defined the year ahead more than intention ever could. People understood this implicitly. January 1st did not inspire promises. It confirmed constraints. As the morning progressed, the day settled into its familiar pace. The new year did not announce itself again. It did not ask for acknowledgement. It moved quietly alongside everyone else, unnoticed, uncelebrated, unavoidable. And perhaps this was the truest experience of January 1st in the 1800s. Not hope or despair, but quiet acceptance. The year had changed. Life had not. And so the day continued, steady and indifferent, carrying people forward, whether they felt ready or not. As January 1st continued into morning, the quiet reality of the day became harder to ignore. The new year did not pause anyone's obligations. It did not soften labor or excuse absence. The hours moved forward with the same steady pressure they always had, pulling people into motion regardless of what the calendar claimed. Time, once again, belonged to work rather than meaning. Outside, winter controlled the pace of everything. Roads were stiff with frost or mud. Footsteps sounded sharper in the cold air. Breath stayed visible longer than usual. Travel was slower, more deliberate. A short walk could feel longer on a January morning, especially when the body was already tired before the day truly began. For laborers, January 1st often marked no change at all. Mills, workshops, docks, and fields resumed their demands. Employers did not acknowledge the year's beginning with rest. Wages did not increase because time had advanced. The body was still expected to perform, to endure cold, repetition, and long hours without complaint. The year began inside the same physical limits as the last. Inside homes, domestic work thickened as the day progressed. Cold weather meant more fuel, more preparation, more care. Fires needed constant attention. Water froze easily. Cleaning took longer. Cooking required patience. The household did not feel renewed. It felt strained by season and necessity. Women often carried the emotional weight of the day quietly. The calendar reminded them of time passing, children growing, bodies aging, responsibilities accumulating. January 1st could feel like a marker, not of possibility, but of endurance. Another year of managing scarcity, illness, or uncertainty lay ahead. These thoughts were rarely spoken aloud. Meals at midday were practical and brief. There was no indulgence reserved for the first day of the year. Food was consumed for strength rather than celebration. Eating was another task folded into the day, not a moment set apart. Hunger was managed carefully in winter. Excess had little place. Social interaction remained restrained. People greeted one another politely, sometimes acknowledging the new year in passing, but without ceremony. There were no long conversations about plans or hopes. Life did not encourage speculation. The future was shaped by forces beyond individual control, and most understood this deeply. Children returned to instruction or chores quickly. There was no holiday atmosphere to prolong rest. Education, where it existed, resumed. Discipline returned. The year's beginning offered no leniency. Young bodies learned early that time moved forward, regardless of feeling. Emotionally, January 1st could feel strangely hollow. Not sad, but unmarked. The absence of expectation left space, and that space could feel uncomfortable. Without noise or ritual to guide emotion, people felt the day pass without knowing how to name it. Have you ever felt that quiet distance between what a day is supposed to mean and what it actually feels like? Letters, if written, were practical. There were no floods of correspondence wishing joy or transformation. Communication focused on needs, arrangements, survival. Words were used carefully. Paper, ink, and effort were not wasted on abstraction. As afternoon approached, fatigue surfaced early. Winter shortened daylight and lengthened effort. The body felt the accumulated weight of seasons rather than the promise of a new one. January 1st did not energize. It drained quietly. Religious reflection, where present, emphasized humility and restraint. Sermons reminded listeners of duty rather than destiny. The new year was framed as something to be lived carefully, not conquered. Moral steadiness mattered more than personal ambition. For those alone, the day could stretch uncomfortably. Boarding houses, rented rooms, and isolated dwellings amplified the sense of continuation without attachment. January 1st offered no built-in companionship. Loneliness did not pause for symbolic time. By late afternoon, the year already felt old. Not because much had happened, but because nothing had changed. The mind adjusted quickly, accepting that this was simply another day wearing a different name. By the time January 1st reached its middle hours, the idea of a new beginning had faded almost entirely. Whatever symbolic meaning the date carried had already been absorbed by routine. Time in the 1800s was not something people paused to admire or reset. It pressed forward steadily, measured less by calendars and more by the body's fatigue and the season's demands. The afternoon light of winter was brief and uncertain. Clouds often flattened the sky into a pale, unmoving surface. Sunlight, when it appeared, felt distant rather than warming. People noticed this instinctively. January 1st did not brighten the world. It revealed how little light the season was willing to offer. Inside homes, the passage of time was felt through small repetitions. Fires needed feeding, floors needed crossing, hands returned again and again to the same tools. These actions did not feel meaningful, but they were grounding. They reminded people that life continued through motion, not reflection. Clocks, where they existed, were rarely consulted for emotional reassurance. Timekeeping was practical. Hours mattered only insofar as they structured labor or rest. The idea that a new year should inspire personal evaluation was not yet widespread. Self-improvement was not framed as a yearly obligation. Survival occupied that space instead. For many women, January 1st carried a subtle emotional tension. The year's beginning could highlight how long responsibilities had already been carried. Children had aged, bodies had changed, opportunities had narrowed quietly. These realizations did not arrive dramatically. They surfaced slowly, between tasks, often unspoken. Men experienced the day differently, but not more optimistically. Labor defined identity strongly. A new year meant another cycle of physical demand. Aging was felt through stiffness, endurance, and recovery rather than numbers. January 1st did not soften the awareness of limitation. It reinforced it. Those living alone or in rented rooms felt time particularly sharply. Boarding houses and lodging rooms offered little insulation from the calendar's quiet advance. Without family rhythms to absorb attention, the day could feel long and unanchored. January 1st did not bring visitors. It brought silence. Social expectations did not encourage sharing these thoughts. Emotional restraint was valued. Reflection occurred privately, often unconsciously. People noticed changes without naming them. Have you ever felt time moving forward without knowing exactly when you noticed it happening? Afternoon work continued steadily. There were no shortened hours to honor the year's start. Employers expected consistency. The calendar did not negotiate on behalf of the worker. The body adjusted, even when the spirit lagged behind. Children sensed the mood indirectly. Adults moved with less urgency, but no less obligation. The absence of celebration taught them something important about time that it passed, whether acknowledged or not. January 1st became part of their understanding of continuity rather than excitement. Illness often lingered in winter, and January 1st did not protect anyone from it. Coughs persisted. Weakness remained. The new year did not bring immediate healing. Care continued as it had before, shaped by habit rather than hope. As daylight declined, people became aware of the evening approaching earlier than expected. Winter shortened the visible world. The year's first day felt incomplete, not because something was missing, but because darkness arrived so soon. Time folded inward. There were moments of quiet thought during these hours. Not deliberate meditation, but awareness. Another year had begun, and life looked much the same. This realization was not framed as failure. It was accepted as reality. The calendar was a marker, not a promise. Letters written later in the day reflected this tone. Practical updates, modest acknowledgments, restrained language. There were no declarations of transformation. Words were shaped by realism rather than aspiration. As evening approached, the body prepared itself automatically. Tasks slowed. Fires were adjusted. Supper was arranged simply. The new year did not demand special treatment. It entered the household like an unannounced guest who intended to stay quietly. Emotionally, the day settled into neutrality. Not sadness, not joy, just continuation. January 1st had revealed itself fully by now, not as a beginning, but as another step forward in a long, uninterrupted sequence. And perhaps this was the most honest experience of the day. The 1st of January in the 1800s did not insist on meaning. It allowed people to move through it without pressure to feel differently. The year had changed its number. Life continued its pace, and in that quiet persistence, time made itself known, gently, steadily, without asking for attention. The year's beginning did not shorten these tasks. January 1st passed with little acknowledgement beyond polite habit. Children sensed the heaviness of the night. Bedtime arrived early, guided by darkness rather than clocks. Sleep was encouraged quickly to conserve fuel and energy. The new year did not delay rest. It reinforced routine. Emotionally, evening could bring subtle reflection, not intentional evaluation, but awareness. Another year had arrived, and life remained unchanged. This realization was neither comforting nor distressing. It simply existed. Have you ever noticed how night invites thoughts you did not ask for? Religion, where present, framed the evening with restraint. Prayer emphasized endurance and humility. There was no insistence on renewal. Faith offered structure, not transformation. The year was something to be lived carefully rather than reshaped. For those grieving, the day could feel particularly hollow. The year advanced without regard for loss. Time did not pause to acknowledge absence. January 1st reminded them quietly that life moved forward regardless. Outside, the night looked much the same as any other winter evening. Streets were dim, sounds were muted. The sky offered no sign that the year had changed. Nature did not recognize the calendar. As fires dimmed and households grew still, January 1st completed itself without announcement. It had not inspired, celebrated, or promised. It had simply passed, leaving behind the same quiet endurance it found. And so the first night of the year settled in cold, familiar, unremarkable. The year had begun, not with hope or fear, but with continuation. And in that continuation, people rested, ready to wake again into a world that expected the same effort tomorrow as it had yesterday. By the time the house grew fully quiet on the night of January 1st, the idea of a new year had finally taken on its true shape, not as a beginning, and not as an ending, but as a long stretch of time now unfolding ahead. Darkness did what daylight could not. It slowed the body enough for awareness to surface. The year no longer felt symbolic. It felt heavy, present, and unavoidable. Night before electricity carried a particular depth. Without constant illumination, darkness filled rooms completely. Corners disappeared, shapes softened. The world shrank to what could be touched, heard, or remembered. January 1st did not brighten this darkness. It entered it fully, becoming part of it. Sleep came unevenly. Some fell into it quickly. The body, overtaken by fatigue, accumulated over weeks of winter labor. Others lay awake, aware that the calendar had shifted, even if life had not. Thoughts moved slowly, without urgency, circling familiar concerns: money, health, work, family. Another year meant more of all these, not less. For women especially, night often brought the clearest awareness of time passing. During the day, tasks absorbed attention. At night, when movement stopped, memory filled the space. Children grown, opportunities missed. Bodies changed quietly over years of repetition. January 1st did not introduce these thoughts, but it gave them room to speak. Bedrooms were rarely private. Sleep was shared, negotiated, interrupted. Breathing, shifting, coughing filled the darkness. The new year did not grant solitude. It reinforced closeness, whether desired or not. The body adjusted to presence rather than silence. In boarding houses, night felt especially restrained. Strangers slept within earshot. Each person carried their own version of the year ahead, unknown to the others. January 1st passed between them without ceremony, unacknowledged but shared. Dreams, when they came, did not reflect hope. They reflected habit. The mind rehearsed what it already knew. The year entered sleep quietly, blending into memory rather than reshaping it. Those who woke during the night often lay still, listening. The house spoke softly, wood shifting, wind pressing, distant sounds of other lives continuing. Time felt suspended. January 1st seemed far away in these hours, already absorbed into routine. Grief, where present, deepened at night. The calendar advanced without asking permission. Loss did not reset. The year did not pause to allow adjustment. January 1st reminded the grieving that time continued regardless of readiness. For the elderly, night carried its own weight. Another year meant endurance. The body measured time not by dates, but by recovery and pain. January 1st arrived quietly, without reassurance. As the night wore on, sleep returned in fragments. Rest was necessary, not restorative. The year ahead did not promise ease. It promised continuation. Toward morning, awareness shifted again. Darkness softened. The body prepared instinctively to rise. January 1st was already giving way to January 2nd. The year moved forward without reflection. In this way, the first day of the year completed itself, not with resolution or celebration, but with rest shaped by fatigue and acceptance. The new year had entered life not as an idea, but as time, slow, steady, and indifferent. And so the night ended as it always did. The house settled. The body rested as best it could. The year waited patiently for morning, ready to ask the same things it always had. By the time January moved past its first few days, the idea of a new year had fully dissolved into routine. Whatever awareness January 1st had briefly carried was gone, replaced by the familiar weight of continuation. The year no longer felt like a concept. It felt like time pressing forward in small, unremarkable steps, each one nearly indistinguishable from the last. Morning after morning arrived without ceremony. The body no longer registered the calendar at all. Cold dictated, waking more than intention. Stiffness returned before thought. The year was felt first in the joints, in the reluctance to rise, in the quiet calculation of how much energy the day would demand. January did not feel fresh. It felt demanding. Homes adjusted quickly. Supplies were counted again. Fuel was measured carefully. Winter sharpened awareness of limits, and the new year brought no expansion of resources. The year ahead was shaped by what was already present, not by what was hoped for. People lived accordingly, narrowing expectations to fit reality. For women, the year settled into repetition almost immediately. The tasks of care, maintenance, and restraint resumed their steady rhythm. There was no reset of responsibility. Children still needed tending. Clothing still required repair. Meals still demanded planning, within scarcity. The calendar offered no relief from these patterns. The body learned the year through motion. Each repeated task layered fatigue rather than meaning. The year accumulated slowly, day by day, not as memory, but as weight. January did not promise improvement. It asked for endurance. Men experienced the year through labor's persistence. Tools felt familiar, but effort felt heavier. Winter slowed recovery. Another year meant another cycle of strain, without guarantee of reward. Aging was not acknowledged openly, but it was felt quietly in endurance and rest. In shared living spaces, the year passed between people without acknowledgement. Boarding houses, rented rooms, and crowded dwellings offered no privacy for reflection. Life continued collectively, yet emotionally separate. The new year existed among them as a silent agreement to continue. Conversation rarely touched on time itself. People did not discuss goals or futures extensively. The year was too long and too uncertain to speak about confidently. Instead, attention stayed fixed on the immediate weather, work, health, survival. Children adapted quickly. For them, the year was not symbolic. It was simply a continuation of instruction and expectation. Lessons resumed. Discipline returned. January did not soften authority. It reinforced it. Illness remained present, indifferent to the calendar. Winter sickness lingered. Recovery was slow. The new year did not cleanse the body. Care continued as before, guided by habit rather than hope. As days passed, January lost even its name in daily awareness. The year became invisible, carried only by repetition. Time did not feel like progress. It felt like maintenance. Have you ever noticed how quickly beginnings disappear once routine takes over? Emotionally, people adjusted downward. Hope became quieter, more cautious. The year ahead was approached carefully, without assumption. Optimism, where it existed, was private and restrained. Letters written during these days reflected practicality. News of work, health, and weather replaced any acknowledgement of the calendar. The year was referenced rarely, and when it was, without emphasis. Religious life framed time as duty rather than transformation. Sermons emphasized steadiness and obedience. The year was something to be lived correctly, not reshaped personally. Faith reinforced endurance over reinvention. Evenings returned to familiar, quiet lamps, were lit briefly. Meals were simple. The body prepared for rest without reflection. January's early days blended together, forming a continuous stretch rather than a beginning. Sleep settled into its usual pattern. Broken rest, interrupted by cold or thought, returned as expected. Dreams reflected familiarity rather than possibility. The year entered the unconscious as repetition, not renewal. For those carrying grief, the year's persistence could feel heavy. Time moved forward without regard for loss. January did not pause to acknowledge absence. The year continued, indifferent and steady. The elderly felt the year through accumulation. Another year meant endurance, measured carefully. The body kept its own calendar, marking time through pain and recovery rather than dates. As January progressed, the new year ceased to feel new at all. It became indistinguishable from the years before it, differing only in number. Life did not mark the passage with emotion. It absorbed it quietly. Work resumed fully. Expectations hardened. The calendar faded into the background of obligation. The year belonged to routine now, not reflection. By the end of these early days, January 1st felt distant. The beginning had passed unnoticed, leaving behind only continuation. The year had entered life not as an event, but as duration. And perhaps this was the truest experience of the new year in the 1800s. It did not arrive dramatically. It did not change lives overnight. It simply extended what already existed, asking people to carry on. The year became real, not through celebration, but through repetition, through cold mornings, long days, and quiet nights, through endurance rather than expectation. Time did not ask permission to continue. It moved forward steadily, drawing everyone along with it, whether they noticed or not. And so the new year settled fully into place, not as a promise, but as time itself, stretching ahead quietly, patiently, waiting to be lived one ordinary day at a time. By the middle weeks of January, the new year no longer announced itself in any way that mattered. Time had settled fully into the body, into the house, into the rhythm of days that unfolded without distinction. The year was no longer something that arrived. It was something people carried, quietly and continuously, through every ordinary action. Morning began to feel heavier as winter deepened. Cold no longer surprised the body. It was expected, anticipated, and met with resignation rather than resistance. People rose not because they felt rested, but because remaining still too long invited stiffness and discomfort. The year made itself known first through fatigue, not thought. Homes reflected this adjustment. Fires were tended with practiced efficiency. Fuel was counted carefully. The year ahead was measured in supplies rather than possibilities. January taught restraint early, and that lesson shaped behavior more than any symbolic meaning attached to the calendar. Women experienced this weight of time through repetition that never truly paused. Each day demanded the same sequence of tasks, layered one upon another. The year did not reset responsibility. It extended it. Care, cleaning, preparation, and restraint formed a continuous chain that did not acknowledge beginnings or endings. The body learned the year through wear rather than awareness. Hands became rougher. Movement slowed slightly. Energy was conserved instinctively. Another year meant another gradual shift away from ease, though few would have named it that way. Time changed people without asking them to notice. Men carried the year through labor that rarely varied. Work resumed with the same expectations, the same demands. The year did not bring renewal of strength. It tested endurance. Muscles adapted not by growing stronger, but by learning how to continue despite strain. In shared living spaces, time felt communal but isolating. Boarding houses and rented rooms brought many lives into proximity without intimacy. Everyone moved forward together, yet alone. The year passed through these spaces quietly, leaving no mark beyond routine. Conversation rarely turned toward the future. People spoke about weather, work, and health. These were the measures of time that mattered. The year ahead was too uncertain to discuss comfortably. Silence often felt safer than speculation. Children adjusted quickly, absorbing the year as structure rather than concept. Discipline returned fully. Instruction resumed. January taught them early that time did not pause for reflection. It demanded participation. Illness continued without regard for the calendar. Winter ailments lingered. Recovery remained slow. The new year did not cleanse the body. Care continued patiently, guided by habit and necessity rather than optimism. As days repeated, January lost its distinctiveness entirely. The year became invisible, present only in the steady accumulation of fatigue and experience. Time no longer felt like movement. It felt like pressure. Emotionally, people narrowed their focus. Hope became cautious. Expectations softened. The year ahead was approached carefully, without assumption. Optimism survived quietly, where it existed at all. Letters written during this period reflected restraint. Practical concerns dominated. The year was mentioned rarely, and when it was, without emphasis. Time did not need to be named to be felt. Religious life framed the year as duty rather than opportunity. Faith offered continuity, not reinvention. The year was something to be lived correctly, not transformed personally. Evenings returned to familiar quiet. Lamps glowed briefly. Meals remained simple. The body prepared for rest without ceremony. The year did not interrupt these patterns. It flowed through them. Sleep settled into its usual rhythm. Rest was fragmented. Dreams reflected repetition rather than possibility. The year entered the unconscious quietly, reinforcing familiarity rather than change. For those carrying grief, time's persistence could feel especially heavy. The year moved forward without regard for loss. January did not pause to acknowledge absence. Time continued, indifferent and steady. The elderly felt the year through accumulation rather than anticipation. Another year meant endurance, measured carefully. The body kept its own record of time, marking it through pain and recovery rather than dates. Work continued without acknowledgement of time passing. Expectations hardened. The year belonged fully to routine now, not reflection. By this point, January 1st felt distant and irrelevant. The beginning had passed unnoticed, leaving only continuation. The year had entered life not as an event, but as duration. Time did not announce itself anymore. It pressed forward quietly, shaping lives without permission or pause. And so the year continued, not as a promise, not as a threat, but as something people carried day after day, often without naming it, until it became simply the way life felt. By late January, the year no longer felt new, but it had not yet become familiar. It existed in a narrow space between expectation and endurance. What carried people through this period were not thoughts or intentions, but objects. Ordinary, unchanged, often overlooked things held the year together more reliably than belief or hope ever could. Every home contained objects that rarely moved. A chair positioned near the hearth, a table marked by years of use, a shelf holding the same items in the same order. These things offered stability when time itself felt uncertain. They reminded people, without words, that life continued because it always had. In winter, objects gained importance because movement was limited. People spent longer hours indoors, noticing details that warmer months allowed them to ignore. The year pressed people closer to their surroundings, making familiarity a source of quiet comfort rather than boredom. A single cup used daily carried weight through repetition. It warmed hands, marked pauses, and structured time without ceremony. Morning and evening became defined not by clocks, but by when that cup was filled and emptied. The year settled into these moments unnoticed. Clothing played a similar role. Winter garments were reused constantly, mended carefully, and stored deliberately. A coat held the memory of previous winters, carrying warmth and wear from years that blended together. The year did not replace these items. It relied on them. Beds became central to endurance. Sleep was rarely luxurious, but it was necessary. Mattresses sagged, blankets thinned, and yet each night returned to the same arrangement. The year depended on this predictability. Rest occurred not because it was comfortable, but because it was familiar. In boarding houses, objects often marked personal territory more clearly than walls ever could. A small box beneath a bed, a book placed deliberately on a shared shelf. These items signaled presence, continuity, and quiet claim. The year moved forward through these small assertions of belonging. Kitchens revealed time through wear rather than novelty. Utensils dulled, surfaces smoothed. Nothing announced the year had changed. Meals continued with the same tools, reinforcing that survival mattered more than symbolism. Candles and lamps structured evenings with gentle authority. Light faded gradually, encouraging rest without instruction. The year entered sleep through this slow dimming, teaching bodies to surrender to routine rather than resist it. Written objects held time differently. Account books, letters, and ledgers recorded continuity more than change. Dates advanced steadily, but content remained similar. The year progressed line by line without emphasis. Children interacted with objects instinctively, repeating habits without question. Toys were few and unchanged. Familiarity provided security. The year unfolded through repetition rather than anticipation. Illness altered relationships with objects. Medicines, cloths, and bedding gained emotional weight. Care depended on what was already present. The year did not bring relief automatically. It relied on patience and persistence. Religious items offered consistency. Books, symbols, and rituals connected days together without demanding emotional renewal. Faith supported endurance rather than excitement. The year passed through these practices quietly. In silence, objects seemed to absorb time. A clock ticking softly reminded people that the year moved forward regardless of attention. Its presence reassured more than it pressured. Work tools remained unchanged. Their familiarity allowed labor to continue despite fatigue. The year tested bodies, not instruments. Objects outlasted energy, offering reliability when strength faltered. Women often formed the closest relationship with domestic objects, not through affection, but through responsibility. Care depended on these items functioning correctly. The year demanded attention to maintenance rather than transformation. Men relied on tools that bore visible marks of time. Worn handles, dulled edges, repaired parts. These objects reflected endurance rather than renewal. The year extended their usefulness rather than replacing them. Even personal keepsakes remained static. Photographs, letters, small mementos did not mark the new year explicitly. They existed outside the calendar, reminding people that time accumulated rather than restarted. In shared spaces, objects created rhythm. Meals at the same table. Chairs returned to the same positions. Order persisted without enforcement. The year relied on this quiet agreement. As January progressed, these objects anchored life more firmly than any resolution ever could. The year did not ask people to imagine change. It asked them to continue. Time passed not because people planned it, but because objects held it steady long enough for life to move forward. By the time the year moved deeper beyond its opening weeks, it no longer announced itself at all. January had already passed, and with it, the fragile feeling that time could be restarted. What followed was not disappointment, but adjustment. The year began to live inside the body rather than in thought. People noticed this first through fatigue, not dramatic exhaustion, but a steady weight that settled into muscles and breath. Days continued without resistance, yet energy no longer surged forward. The body accepted the year as something to be carried, not confronted. Morning routines became automatic again. Rising did not feel new or deliberate. It simply happened, shaped by habit rather than intention. The year did not demand motivation. It depended on repetition. Sleep changed subtly. Dreams became less vivid, more fragmented, filled with familiar spaces rather than imagined futures. The body processed time quietly during rest, storing memory without commentary. Nights passed without ceremony. Work resumed its ordinary rhythm. Fields, shops, kitchens, and corridors absorbed labor without acknowledging the calendar. Tasks returned to their usual pace, no longer shaped by the anticipation of beginnings. In shared living spaces, conversation softened. People spoke less about plans and more about necessities. The year narrowed attention to what immediately mattered. Survival replaced symbolism. Illness often appeared during this period. Winter lingered, weakening bodies already worn by cold and limited rest. Care was practical, unromantic, and repetitive. The year tested endurance quietly. Women often felt this shift most strongly. Responsibility did not lessen with time. It accumulated. The year settled into their movements, lifting, cleaning, tending, until effort became invisible, even to themselves. Men carried fatigue differently. Shoulders tightened. Movements slowed slightly. The year revealed itself, not through emotion, but through physical restraint. Children adapted without awareness. Their days blended together, marked by meals and sleep rather than dates. The year passed through them lightly. Older people felt time most sharply. Memory stretched backward more than forward. The year felt like continuation rather than progression. Another layer added to many already lived. Silence deepened in the evenings. Less was said because less needed explanation. The year had established its presence. It no longer required acknowledgement. Homes adjusted accordingly. Fires burned longer but lower. Light was conserved. Objects remained in place. The year encouraged restraint rather than expansion. Religious observance continued without heightened feeling. Ritual supported continuity rather than renewal. Faith became steadiness, not inspiration. Losses were absorbed during this period. Deaths, departures, and absences did not shock. They settled into routine quietly, reshaping daily life without ceremony. Grief appeared subtly, not as interruption, but as a change in pacing. Tasks took longer. Silence increased. The year allowed grief to exist without resolution. People stopped counting days. Time passed through sensation rather than measurement. Cold mornings, dim afternoons, early nights. The year defined itself through repetition. Objects bore witness. Tools wore further. Clothing thinned. Furniture absorbed weight. These changes recorded time more honestly than any calendar. Social life narrowed. Visits became fewer but longer. Presence mattered more than novelty. The year favored familiarity. In boarding houses, coexistence grew quieter. Boundaries were respected through silence. The year taught people how to live beside one another without friction. Memory shifted focus. Recent events blurred, while older memories resurfaced unexpectedly. The year loosened the hold of immediacy. Hope did not disappear, it simply changed form. Instead of anticipation, it became patience, the belief that continuation itself held value. By now, the year lived fully inside the body. Breathing adjusted. Muscles learned the rhythm. The mind followed slowly. Time no longer asked permission. It moved through routine, carried by habit rather than desire. And so the year continued, not loudly, not optimistically, but steadily, held together by endurance, shaped by repetition, and accepted without resistance. By the time the year reached its later stretch, it no longer felt new, difficult, or demanding. It felt ordinary. This was not failure, it was completion. Time, once noticed and measured, had dissolved back into routine where it belonged. People no longer thought about the year as something they were inside. They simply lived. Days passed without internal commentary. Mornings arrived without reflection. Nights came without resistance. The body accepted time fully, no longer questioning its movement. Work felt heavier but familiar. Muscles knew what was expected before the mind did. Hands moved ahead of thought. This was not numbness, it was adaptation. The body carried the year without asking what it meant. Sleep became deeper, though shorter. Exhaustion accumulated quietly, layered rather than dramatic. Rest no longer promised renewal. It offered maintenance. Enough strength to continue, nothing more. Homes reflected this shift. Objects stayed where they had settled months earlier. Nothing was rearranged with intention. Stability mattered more than improvement. The house mirrored the body, functional, worn, enduring. Conversations softened further. Words were chosen carefully, or not at all. Silence filled space without discomfort. People learned to exist beside one another without explanation. The year had taught restraint. Memory became selective. Certain moments remained sharp, while others dissolved entirely. Time kept what was necessary and released the rest. This was not loss, it was efficiency. Women felt the year settle most clearly in their posture. Movements slowed slightly, conserving energy. Care continued, but with less urgency. Experience replaced effort. Men carried the year through repetition. Days blended together, differentiated only by physical sensation, soreness, cold, warmth. Time passed through the body rather than the mind. Children adapted completely. The year meant nothing to them. They lived inside routine without questioning its length. Time was not measured, it was inhabited. Older people sensed closure without fear. The year felt like one more layer added to many before it. Continuation, not conclusion. Seasonal change occurred quietly. Weather shifted without announcement. People adjusted clothing and work without reflection. Nature did not acknowledge calendars, neither did they. Illness appeared and passed without narrative. Care remained practical. Recovery was expected. Loss, when it occurred, was absorbed into routine rather than dramatized. Religious observance remained steady. Faith did not promise change, it offered rhythm. The year required consistency more than belief. In boarding houses, coexistence reached its calmest state. Boundaries were understood. Presence was tolerated without expectation. The year had taught people how to remain without attachment. Objects showed where honestly, tools dulled, fabric thinned, furniture sagged slightly. These signs were accepted, not corrected. Time left its mark openly. Evenings grew quieter. Fewer lights were used. Fires burned lower. The body prepared for rest earlier, without negotiation. Fatigue guided behavior more than thought. Dreams became sparse and indistinct. Sleep focused on restoration, not imagination. The mind rested because it was permitted to. Grief, when present, had softened. Sharp edges were gone. Memory remained, but it no longer interrupted function. Time had absorbed pain into routine. Hope existed quietly, not as anticipation, but as endurance. The belief that continuation itself was enough. People stopped marking time altogether. Days passed because they always had. The year no longer needed recognition. As the final weeks approached, there was no sense of ending, only continuation. Time did not prepare anyone for change. It simply kept moving. The body sensed closure before the mind did. Fatigue deepened slightly. Movements slowed. Rest became more deliberate. Homes responded similarly. Fires were tended carefully. Supplies were conserved. Nothing was wasted on symbolism. When the year finally approached its end, it did not announce itself. There was no emotional shift, only recognition that routine would soon repeat. The final night felt like any other. Supper was eaten, work ended, light faded, sleep arrived. There was no reflection on what had passed, no summary, no evaluation. Time did not require judgment. Morning would arrive again. Another year would begin without permission. This was how time truly ended before electricity, not with meaning, but with continuity. Life did not pause to acknowledge itself. It simply continued until it could not. By the time the last days of the year arrived, people no longer felt that they were approaching something. There was no sense of threshold, no emotional edge. The calendar changed, but life did not pause to notice it. Time moved forward because it always had, not because anyone asked it to. The final week passed quietly. Work continued at a slightly slower pace, shaped more by fatigue than reflection. Bodies were worn but cooperative. They knew how to finish what had been started. There was no urgency to complete the year properly. Completion was not expected. Evenings became especially still. Fires burned lower, conserved rather than celebrated. Light was used carefully. People sat longer in silence, not because they were thinking, but because there was nothing left to say. The year had already spoken through repetition. Women felt this silence deeply. The house responded to their movements with familiarity. Every sound had meaning. Every task followed muscle memory rather than intention. There was no desire to mark the passing of time, only the need to maintain order long enough for rest to arrive. Men returned home without comment. Fatigue replaced conversation. Meals were eaten slowly, without ceremony. Hunger was satisfied, not indulged. The body guided the evening more than habit. Children slept earlier, exhausted by cold and routine. Their understanding of time did not include endings. Night was simply night. Sleep arrived without thought of what day it was. The house itself seemed to prepare for continuation. Floors creaked as they always had. Walls held warmth unevenly. Objects remained exactly where they belonged. Nothing was rearranged to signal closure. There was no collective reflection on what the year had brought. Hardship was not reviewed. Loss was not summarized. Survival did not require explanation. It had already occurred. Sleep on the final nights was heavier, though not deeper. Dreams were brief, and unremarkable. The mind rested because it was allowed to. Tomorrow did not demand anticipation. The final evening passed without recognition. Supper was eaten, dishes were cleared, fires were banked, candles were extinguished. Darkness arrived without significance. No one counted hours. No one waited for midnight. Time crossed itself quietly. Morning came as it always did. Light entered the same windows. Cold settled in familiar places. Bodies rose without celebration. Another day had begun. The new year arrived, unnoticed. There was no sense of renewal, no emotional reset, only continuation. Work resumed, care resumed. Routine absorbed the change effortlessly. This was how time functioned before electricity, not as an event, but as a condition. Years did not begin or end. They accumulated. Memory adjusted slowly. What belonged to the previous year dissolved into habit. The body carried experience forward without naming it. Homes remained unchanged. Objects retained their wear. Nothing was replaced simply because time had passed. Evenings returned to their steady rhythm. Light faded. Fires dimmed. Sleep arrived. Life did not require permission to continue. And so the year ended, not with reflection, but with persistence. Time moved forward because it always had. That was enough.